Hey guys, welcome back to the third video in this series. If you didn't catch the first two videos where I gave some introduction, I'll put links to those in the description and at the end of this video. So let's jump into the prospects, starting with arguably the top returning sophomore, maybe the top returner in all college basketball, Terquavion Smith from NC State. Clearly, what makes Turk an intriguing prospect begins with his shooting potential. He put up a massive amount of three-point attempts as a freshman. In fact, he topped J.J. Redick's freshman records for three-point attempts and makes. Roughly one-third of his made threes were unassisted, indicating his ability to pull up and create deep shots. He made 37.1% of his threes on a high sample volume, so we could be fairly confident, even at this point, that Turk is a plus shooter. Given the high sample size last season, I would predict Turk likely shoots somewhere between 35 to 40% this upcoming season. If he comes in below this range, it could temper some of the enthusiasm for his shooting outcomes. There are a couple of question marks or potentially negative indicators on Turk's shooting profile that we should address. He shot 68% from the line on 75 attempts. You'll rarely find elite NBA shooters who shot under 70% from the free throw line as freshmen in college. While I'm not overly concerned with this signal because the sample size was fairly small, it is an area where I'd like to see Turk improve, or at least show that his freshman season was maybe a bit of a small sample size theater result. While we're on the subject of free throw shooting, it would be good to point out that his free throw rate, which is defined as the number of free throw attempts divided by the number of field goal attempts, was 0.17, which coincidentally landed him in the 17th percentile. This is pretty low on the face of it, but if we think about the context of his shot distribution, which is roughly 60% three-point attempts, I think we can excuse away most of the concern here, as the simple fact that jump shooters don't get fouled that often in the act of shooting. Getting back to his shooting profile, another potential area of concern that I can't excuse away too easily is the fact that he only shot 44% on layups. Typically, one would expect layup percentage to be around 60%. Given that Turk attempted nearly 100 layups last season, this definitely is an area where I'd like to see him improve, and I assume NBA teams will be looking for that as well. The most obvious explanation for this deficiency is Turk's slight frame, giving him a bit of trouble finishing around the rim consistently. But overall, it's pretty clear that Turk's shooting profile is a plus, and that's what makes him an intriguing prospect for largely. So I have a few other areas I wanted to take note of before we move to the next prospect. Typically, I look for steal percentage above 2% in guards, and Turk comes in at 2.5%. If you're not familiar with this signal, it's a bit counterintuitive, so I want to be clear here. While one would think steal percentage is mostly an indicator of defensive ability, there has been some research that actually suggests it's more of an overall sign for quote-unquote goodness in point guards and guards in general. The causality is not certain, but some hypotheses are that higher steal percentage could indicate things like quickness of hands, anticipation of defense, and generally a level of perception that could translate to the next level. Turk also had 14 blocks on the season, which given his size and the fact that he's a perimeter-oriented player is actually really impressive. This is a similar rate to Bones Hyland as a freshman at VCU, and it should be noted that some guards struggle to get even low single-digit block numbers in multiple seasons at the college level. For example, Jalen Brunson had 1 block in 3 seasons at Villanova. So to be clear, while I'm not using this stat to suggest Turk is a rim protector, certainly not, I do think it's generally a good signal for his NBA translation eventually. Another statistical area where Turk showed out perhaps surprisingly well given his frame and role is rebounding. The fact that his numbers are in the 40th to 50th percentile is actually fairly impressive. Just to give some context here, the threshold for guard rebounding that I tend to look for is around 10% on the defensive rebounding percentage. Turk comes in at 13.2%, which is well above that threshold. Let's move on to Turk's playmaking, which is a bit of a mixed bag at this point. On the positive side is that he turned the ball over very infrequently, as evidenced by his turnover percentage being in the 93rd percentile. Since turnovers are in the denominator of assist-to-turnover ratio, that stat also comes in fairly high, being around the 80th percentile. That being said, Turk would definitely benefit in his draft stock if he could move his assist rate up and show NBA teams he has some lead guard potential. One quick hit I'd like to note before we move on is that Turk's 14 dunk attempts is another good athletic indicator. Putting this in perspective, again, I'll point to Bones Hyland, who had 5 dunks in 2 seasons at VCU. I also think it's pretty neat and a bit weird that all of Turk's dunks are left-handed, even though he shoots right-handed. Of course, this is a stat I got from watching him play, not my stats database. Okay, so we're pretty much done with Terquavion Smith, who is an obvious NBA prospect. One thing I'd like to note here as we finish out on Turk is that up until now, I've not mentioned once how many points he scored per game or during the season. In fact, I have no idea how many. So the next guy up on my list is returning freshman is Daeshun Ruffin, who plays for Ole Miss. Daeshun injured his ACL on February 1st and missed the rest of his freshman season, unfortunately. So he only totaled about 350 minutes, and yet he was very productive in those minutes. My guess is that it was unlikely he would have declared for the draft, even if he played the entire season. Simply put, despite being this high on my rankings, I'm very skeptical of his brand. Let me explain why. Daeshun is 5'9" and weighs 160 pounds. There's no getting around the fact that he's just extremely small, and that's not something he can work on. At his size, Daeshun will have to put up monster numbers as a sophomore. And even then, I'll remain skeptical because his size is just a tremendously difficult obstacle to overcome, and I don't want to sugarcoat it for you guys. Now that my skepticism has been noted, I should point out that there are some areas on the court that Daeshun needs to work on in any case. He only shot 22% on 49 three-point attempts last season. I don't know if this was just a bad sample for him. To be clear, 49 attempts is a small sample, or if he's just not a good shooter. Either way, he needs to prove he can shoot threes to have any hope of being considered an NBA prospect at his size. In addition to improving his three-point shooting, Ruffin only shot 18% on his 39 mid-range attempts. Yes, small sample, but it still adds some increasing skepticism to his projection as a shooter. Someone with Ruffin's physical profile doesn't just need to prove he's a good shooter, he basically has to become an elite shooter. It's hard to overestimate how difficult a path this will be for him. I know it sounds like piling on at this point, but another area that is pretty scary for projecting his success at the next level is the fact that he was in the third percentile for defensive rebounding at 6.8%, well below the 10% threshold I noted earlier for guard rebounding. So is there anything redeeming here, and why the heck is he so high on my rankings in the first place? Well, his assist rate is pretty much elite, being in the 98th percentile. Unfortunately, this is somewhat undone by his turnover percentage being in the third percentile. If he can maintain the former and improve the latter, say get his assist to turnover ratio up towards 2 or even 3, optimistically, then you're at least looking at a very impressive playmaker. In addition, Ruffin had 31 steals in his limited minutes on the court, giving him a steal percentage above 5, which is incredibly high along the lines of a Marcus Smart in college. Kennedy Chandler and Zakai Ziegler also put up steal percentages above 5% last season. So maybe one can argue it's just the fact of being a lightning quick guard. Still, that's an impressive figure, well above the magical 2% threshold I mentioned earlier. To round out the positives, it should be noted that Ruffin had a usage rate above 30%, which is really high. He wasn't as efficient as he needs to be, obviously, but at least it shows that he is able to create shots. His high usage, assists, and steals are likely the leading contributors to his being this high on my rankings, but it should also be clear by his example why we really need to scrutinize both the stats and the eye test when we're evaluating prospects. So just to be clear, I watched Terquavion Smith quite a bit last year because it was pretty obvious to me that he was a legit prospect, as his profile consisted of so many positives and a few negatives that he can work on. Contrast that with Daeshun Ruffin, who I just have a hard time taking seriously as a prospect because there's so much to improve on and one mountain of an issue that he simply can't correct, that being his height. My guess is Ruffin will continue to appear near the top of my rankings for the next few seasons, and I will continue to mostly ignore him until he is so good on the court that I simply am forced to pay more attention. I know this sounds harsh, but the hard fact is that we have around 15 to 20 sophomores that will be drafted or signed as free agents, and I need to prioritize my time accordingly to this group. And by the way, if you feel I'm being too negative on Daeshun Ruffin, please leave a comment and tell me why I'm wrong. It definitely happens. Okay, so the next prospect up is Tyrese Hunter, who played for Iowa State as a freshman but is transferring to Texas this season. So Tyrese popped on my radar fairly early last season as a small but wiry athletic point guard that feels like he's just a jump shot away from being a potential first-round pick. He was a little bit behind Kennedy Chandler last season in terms of the hype machine and ultimately decided to return to school, which is probably a wise decision considering Chandler was drafted in the mid-second round and another somewhat comparable prospect, J.D. Davison, wasn't taken until pick 53. So you might be wondering why I already seem higher on Hunter while I was so rough on Ruffin. Take that for alliteration. Well, Tyrese has a few advantages that to many in the draft community might seem fairly small, but to me appear more like an uncrossable chasm. The first thing that comes to mind is that Tyrese Hunter will not turn 20 until 2 months after the 2023 draft. He would have been one of the youngest players in the 22 draft if he had declared. The honor for the youngest goes to Jalen Duren, who somehow doesn't even turn 19 until this November. Players that have summer birthdays like Tyrese always feel like a gift to me in terms of draft opportunities. Contrast this with Daeshun Ruffin, who turns 21 2 months before the draft. That's right, he's almost a year and a half older than Tyrese Hunter. Even if the two prospects were about equal at this point, the age advantage for Hunter is massive, at least in my way of thinking. Also, I swear, I'm going to stop thinking of bad things to say about Ruffin. I'm not trying to be a dick, I promise. So beyond age, where else does Hunter look more intriguing to me? Well, he put up a 13.1% defensive rebounding percentage. Remember, that's better than the 10% threshold I hold on to, and nearly twice that of Ruffin. Furthermore, Hunter had 17 dunk attempts last season. only missing one. Compare that to 0 for Ruffin. Of course, Ruffin only played about a quarter of the season, but it's hard to imagine he would have had anywhere near the number of dunks Hunter had. At just 6 feet, having 17 dunk attempts is massively impressive. While Hunter didn't have a higher steal percentage than Ruffin, he came in at 3.8% over a full season, which still puts him in the 98th percentile. Hunter's passing stats are perhaps even a bit more impressive than Ruffin as well, rating in the 99th percentile in assist rate and assist percentage, and 88th percentile in assist to turnover ratio. Like Ruffin, however, Hunter could stand to improve on his turnover rate, but given how young he is, I have little doubt that that will happen over time, and likely this upcoming season. One final positive indicator before we move on to areas for improvement is his block rate. Hunter blocked 10 shots last season. That's just really, really good at his size. Sorry I lied. There's just one more thing I should mention that gives Hunter a huge advantage over Ruffin. He's 3 inches taller. You know the saying, every inch counts. In basketball, obviously the difference between 5'9" and 6 feet is huge. Even though both players are always simply going to be considered small. Hunter is small. Ruffin is likely too small. Okay, so I think I've established Hunter as a better prospect than Ruffin, but again, with apologies to Daeshun, that's not a super high bar. Tyrese definitely has some issues that need to be addressed to be worth valuable draft capital, in my opinion. It should be pretty obvious looking at the shooting column that the bulk of the work Tyrese Hunter needs to put in is in the area of shooting, really at every level. I cannot take Hunter seriously as a shooter right now when his free throw percentage is under 70%, his three-point percentage is under 30%, his mid-range percentage is right around 30%, and even his layup percentage is under 50%. Small samples could explain away maybe one or two deficiencies, but it really strains credulity to explain away all four of those categories being poor at his position and given his physical profile. Simply put, he needs to get better and fairly quickly if he is to entertain thoughts of being a first-round pick in the 23 draft. So to end this episode, I just want to give a brief list of action items for each of the three prospects we discussed. So starting with Terquavion Smith, it was already obvious last season Turk is a legit NBA prospect. This season, the focus of my attention is really what do I think his NBA role will be and how valuable is that in terms of draft capital. Is there a world where Turk is a lead guard starting for a playoff contender, or is he destined to come off the bench as a gunner and perennial Sixth Man of the Year candidate? It's actually the same sort of questions I was asking about Bones Highland and James Bouknight since their freshman seasons, and to a large extent still am even after their rookie year. At any rate, it is clear that I will be penciling in Turk for several watch nights on my calendar this upcoming season, and I think you should too. Daeshun Ruffin. As you may have guessed by now, I am not enamored with Ruffin's NBA potential. For now, I am triaging him, and will only watch him with intent if he completely blows up and forces me to. Tyrese Hunter. Right now, Hunter is an intriguing but flawed prospect. If his shooting does not improve significantly, he is likely a fringe draft prospect this season, and potentially decides to return to school again. If his shooting does improve, he will be worth the effort to eye test to determine whether he is ever more than a backup point guard in the NBA. For now, I'm grading his prospect chances as a hold for data. I hope you enjoyed a deep dive into the stats of these three guards. The goal here is to spend a little bit of time looking at stats with the hope that it saves you a lot of time on the other end watching games. When I watch games, I try to do it with really focused intention, answering the burning and most vital questions I have about each prospect that I can't simply glean from looking at stats. I believe this process makes me more efficient and smarter about what I choose to watch. I hope it can help you too. If you have any comments or questions, I will try to respond to all of them and maybe answer some in a future episode. Now, as they say, smash that subscribe button so you can get more of this great content in the future.